Trump has upped his threat for Gaza, promising all hell to break loose. As he promises to commit crimes against humanity, he meets with the King of Jordan to discuss his plans to ethnically cleanse Gaza. In the previous video, we talked about the Camp David Accords, including Jordan's involvement in it, so in this one, we'll be focusing on Jordan itself and its inner politics. How did it go from being one of the biggest champions of Palestinians, granting citizenship to all living in the West Bank, to declaring war on the Palestinian Liberation Organization? The year is 1970. It's been 3 years since the disaster of the 1967 war. Palestinians had put their trust in the neighboring governments to stand up for them against Israel and America, a mistake they would never repeat again, a mistake that cost them all the lands they still had, the West Bank and Gaza. The PLO will lead now, and only PLO. But who were the PLO? Palestine Liberation Organization was established in 1964 as a political and military organization aimed at representing the Palestinian people and securing an independent Palestinian state. The PLO was made up of a wide range of Palestinian factions and groups, each with its own ideologies and approaches to the Palestinian struggle. The PLO founding members included Fatah, which is still in power in the West Bank today, and was the largest and most influential factions within it. Led by Yasser Arafat, Fatah was a nationalist movement that sought to establish a Palestinian state through both armed struggle and diplomacy. Arafat became the longtime leader of the PLO and was instrumental in its development, as well as its eventual betrayal of the movement by signing of the Oslo Accords. Fatah had a pro-capitalism, be it with strong social safety nets and welfare programs view for the economy. Now, there were 3 anti-capitalist groups that we have to go over. The first one was the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, also known as PFLP, which was a Marxist-Leninist group founded by George Habash. The PFLP advocated for a revolutionary socialist approach to the Palestinian cause, including violent means of resistance. The second one was the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, which is a totally different leftist group that did actually split from the Popular Front, and it had more of a Maoist approach to liberation. The Popular Front prioritized Palestinian national liberation and was heavily involved in military operations, including airline hijackings and attacks on Israeli and Western targets. The Democratic Front, on the other hand, placed greater emphasis on class struggle, advocating for a socialist revolution that included Arab workers and peasants, not just in Palestine, but in the wider region. Now, there was a third revolutionary anti-capitalist one as well, called the Palestinian People's Party, also known as the PPP, with roots in the Palestinian Communist Movement of 1920s, which was initially part of the Palestine Communist Party under British rule. Unlike the PFLP and DFLP, which had a mix of Maoist and Marxist-Leninist and Third Worldist influences, the PPP was more closely aligned with Soviet Union. It maintained strong ties with it and was considered part of the official communist movement in the Arab world. The last main one was called the Arab Liberation Front, or the ALF, which was a Ba'athist Palestinian faction that was closely aligned with Iraq's Ba'ath Party. Now, the Ba'ath Party was an anti-imperialist Arab nationalist party that was quite progressive at the time of its creation. It sought to create a union between various Arab countries, but with the rise of Saddam Hussein in Iraq and Hafez al-Assad in Syria, all of that kind of went out the window. Unlike other Palestinian groups, the LFA was more of an Iraqi proxy than an actual independent movement. Over time, various smaller factions as well joined the PLO. The PLO also included Palestinian refugee organizations, trade unions, and other civil society groups, so it was intended to be an umbrella organization that represented the various factions of the Palestinian national movement, united, as mentioned, in their goal of throwing away the yoke of Israeli occupation, even though these groups may not have agreed with each other on any other issues. Jordan, which at the time of PLO's creation controlled the West Bank, was initially supportive of the PLO as a means of addressing the Palestinian cause. This was self-serving, however. As they had granted all living in the West Bank citizenship, they hoped to use the PLO to increase their influence in the Palestine region. However, the situation changed after the 1967 war, when Israel captured the West Bank and Gaza Strip, displacing many Palestinians and destroying any hopes Jordan had at increasing its influence within the region of Palestine. As a result, many Palestinians fled to neighboring countries, including Jordan, where they sought refuge and began to organize politically and militarily, even adhering to their own laws and courts. By now, disillusioned by the neighboring Arab regimes, the Palestinians were playing by their own rules. The laws enforced by Palestinian factions in Jordan before 1970 were largely informal but revolutionary, centered on maintaining control within Palestinian communities, organizing resistance against Israel, and ensuring the unity of the Palestinian cause. They were independent from the Jordanian state, and while the Jordanian government still had technically jurisdiction over much of the country, the Palestinian factions operated their own system of governance in the territories they controlled. These laws often conflicted and also humiliated the Jordan's legal system, leading to increased tensions and ultimately the Black September conflict in 1970. During its short time in Jordan, from 1967 to 1970s, the PLO's ideology was influenced by the many groups that was just mentioned. It engaged in quasi-state functions like taxations, policing, and social services. Some of its influences included, for example, welfare, education, and financial assistance to impoverished Palestinian refugees, bypassing Jordanian state institutions that were not being helpful to begin with. Some factions, especially the leftist ones, encouraged labor activism and unions and opposed major landowners, capitalists, and Jordanian elites. The PLO's left-wing factions, particularly the Popular Front, targeted Jordan's monarchy and business elites, advocating for a socialist revolution. Many Palestinian groups relied on a system of communal military support, where fighters shared resources and lived collectively, almost creating a socialist guerrilla communal living kind of situation, a communal living that was too dangerous for the King of Jordan. PLO's leftist rhetoric, success of its social programs, and vast popularity, in addition to their armed presence, threatened King Hussein's rule, leading to tensions between the PLO and Jordan's monarchy. As I mentioned before, this situation culminated in the Black September 1970. But before getting to the events of Black September, let's also take a look at who the King of Jordan was. King Hussein, aside from being was the first cousin of the Faisal I, the king that had briefly ruled Syria in 1920 before the French expelled him. King Faisal I stood for Arab unity, with, as his later rule showed in Iraq, great tolerance for minorities. King Hussein stood for keeping on to power at the cost of complicity with Israel and America. Threatened by PLO's socialism, autonomy, and advocacy for solidarity of all Palestinians and in some cases all Arabs, he betrayed the very people that had once again trusted him for protection. King Hussein not only lost the West Bank to the Israelis, but he also deported the refugees from it 3 years later. In September 1970, after months of escalating tensions, King Hussein orchestrated a military crackdown, leading to intense fighting, especially in Amman and northern Jordan, to expel Palestinian militant groups, leading to violent clashes and eventually the PLO's expulsion to Lebanon in 1971. 5,000 Palestinians were killed. After this, Hussein and his successor, the current king, Abdullah II, never made the mistake of flirting with revolutionary organizations in the Middle East again. Instead, they ensured Jordan never deviated from complicity in Israel's occupation and stayed in line with U.S. foreign policy, a decision that saw them rewarded generously by the U.S., as I explained in military aid received by Jordan in the first video. This also ensured they will never have to deal with the threat of revolution, as they had a major ally both in Israel and the U.S.